Hey, my name's Kirk Jackson. Welcome to this re-record without an audience of my talk tonight to the Vintage Computing Aotearoa online meetup on the Apple III. Now, I bought an Apple III off Trade Me a few years ago, and the reason I was interested in it is because I've always been into Apple IIs, but Apple IIIs was something I didn't really know much about. Um, and there's a really fun podcast called Drop 3 Inches that goes deep into the Apple III history, and that really got me interested in sort of some of the unique parts of an Apple III that you don't see in an Apple II. And I'll share some of that with you in this talk. So today we'll cover what Apple looked like. What was Apple in 1976 to the early 80s? Um, what was the Apple III? Some history of the Apple III, some of its features, some fallout, things that went wrong, um, how Apple III featured in New Zealand. I only have a little bit of information on that. Um, Contemporaneous upgrades and modern upgrades you can do with your Apple III, and then places you could go for more information. So, history. Apple Computers, 1976, released the Apple I. You've probably heard this history well, but some of the bits that were interesting that are relevant here are, Steve Wozniak's design for the Apple I really capitalized on the cheap 6502 processor, which was only $25 compared to other processors of the time that other hobbyist computers were using, such as the 8080 and 6800 that were more than 170 US. And his Apple I combined two parts that were often kept separate: the video terminal, electronic typewriter part, the keyboard and the screen display, and the computer itself. And he figured out how to combine those two parts in a nice hobbyist board. They could sell them as kits or fully assembled, and most of them were assembled in Steve Jobs' house. I think mostly by Daniel Kotke, and then they were sold for the nice number of $666.66. Many of the early ones were sold at the Byte Shop. They think that about 175 to 200 were made, and this computer set Apple on a trajectory. Steve invented this computer, created this computer, and then him and Jobs formed the Apple company. And just about straight away after they started selling the Apple I began his design of the Apple II. And the Apple II sold for $12.95, so it was expensive. Apparently there was a kit for the DIY hobbyist. But the real selling feature of the Apple II was that it came with a keyboard, it had a nice case, had the power supply built in, it had a really great form factor, and you could put a monitor on top, or you could plug it into the TV with an RF modulator. Apple II was selling well, and so Apple started thinking about their future, and so they started this sort of a moonshot project, the Lisa, and it evolved quite a lot. Like, it started off as sort of a mini computer with multiple CPUs and evolved into what became a GUI interface. But back in 1978, when they started that Lisa project, they were looking, what's the next big computer we can build? And they had the Apple II Plus, which was a revision of the II. And the Apple II, it's it was based on the 6502, so it could reference, up to 64K of RAM, but RAM was expensive in 76, and it had got cheaper by the early 80s. But the first models of the Apple II you could buy with 4 kilobytes if you wanted to go cheap, all the way up to 48K, and then the rest of the memory space was for ROM. And around this time, Apple started thinking, well, what comes next? Um, Home computers and hobbyist computers had a really short lifetime in the 70s and 80s, and they knew that, things were evolving quickly, and they were worried that their company needed to do something next uh, to stand out and to keep being viable. The Apple II had some shortcomings. So the early version was uppercase only. Um, it had integer basic and ROM, which was a basic interpreter that was wrote, um, which is great and quite fast, but only supported integers, didn't support floating point arithmetic. One of the selling features of the Apple II was that it supported color graphics in low res and high res. Um, it was quite a quirky memory arrangement to reduce the chip count in the Apple II and to make it cheaper to reduce color graphics and to reuse the clock cycle. But it was one of the first personal computers to support color graphics. It had a built-in machine language monitor with a disassembler and a mini assembler, had memory mapped I/O, and as I said, graphics. And the Apple II really had some killer hardware. So the Disk2 interface that was designed in combination with a really bare bones Shugart drive mechanism um, allowed them to build a much cheaper floppy drive than their competitors. And it performed really well. The encoding let them write more data to disk and use less chips, so it was cheaper to produce. Um, the killer software for the Apple II was VisiCalc. So people bought, you know, Apple designed or was designed the Apple II as a hobbyist machine, but people bought it and realized that they could run parts of their business on it. And people would bring in their Apple IIs into work, pop it on their desk, and use VisiCalc to do business modeling. And they say that VisiCalc sold lots of copies of the Apple II rather than the other way around. Other things that people did to the Apple II to modify it, added shift key mods so that when you press the shift key, software could detect it by running a cable to the joystick port. 80 column cards. There was a few like third party cards before Apple made their own. Printer cards, serial cards. The Apple II was a great platform for building in. It had 8 slots. It sort of encouraged experimentation. The schematic was available. But yeah, as I said, Apple were worried about what will happen next. Many users of Apple II were actually businesses, which was surprising because it was, originally designed as a hobbyist machine. But the market changed. Lisa was a long way off, and Apple needed something sooner. So in 1978, Apple spun up the Sarah project, which was to become the Apple III. Things that they were worried about the IBM PC coming out, they were worried about the upcoming IPO, and this led to them rushing the release of the Apple III before it was really ready. Wendell Sander, one of the creators of the Apple III, says it was 6 to 9 months too early that it went to market. The price of the Apple III was a lot less than $10,000, but once you kitted it out as a business machine, you were looking at a $10,000 plus price, and it was actually one of the most popular, expensive computers for business at the time. So let's zoom through the history a bit. Some of the key characters, I guess, that you hear about in the Drop 3 Inches podcast. Person number 1 is Dr. Wendell Sanders. So he was Apple employee number 16, and he really took over from Woz as one of the engineers, the significant engineers at Apple. He worked in the Apple II team and developed things such as the integrated Woz machine, which was taking the disk controller logic putting it onto a single chip. He invented the language card, which allowed you to swap in up more memory into your Apple II, because the 6502 could only support 64K, but when you wanted to program in other languages, you needed more space for the language interpreter. And he also worked on other Apple II components. And he was the one that was tasked with designing a business-oriented successor to the Apple II that incorporated some of the things that were missing in the Apple II back in 1979 that businesses needed. Another key player, sorry, wrong screen, was Dan Kotke. So Dan Kotke's name is familiar to anyone who knows Apple history. He was the guy that assembled the Apple I's in Steve Jobs' garage. Steve Jobs' sister assembled a couple or a few of them, but Dan Kotke did the majority. He actually knew Jobs back from when they were at college together, had traveled to India with Jobs, and sort of was a long-time friend of him. And they hired him as a technician. He didn't immediately join Apple, but when he did, he was employee number 12, and he was involved in the prototyping of the Apple III. So him and Wendell Sander would work together on the design, and then Daniel would wire wrap up a prototype board with the chips and hook them all together so it could be tested. The photos there are more recent of him. I guess he kept the prototype board of him with the board. Another person that you may not hear about much, but there's a great episode interviewing her on the Drop 3 Inches podcast, is Colette Askeladd. She was the first PCB layout designer employed by Apple. Previously, they'd contracted it out. And she was tasked with designing the PCB for the Apple III. I'll talk about the PCB in the case a bit later as to why her story is significant. She went on to do the circuit boards for the Macintosh, and the Apple III was an incredibly dense circuit board, which they didn't think could be done with computer layout systems at the time, because they were quite limited. And it was also the last circuit board that was laid out by hand, so drawn out, templated on vellum, marked out with tape, and then sent off for manufacture. So the features of the Apple III. Well, here's one I prepared earlier. So this is my Apple III sitting in Wellington on a very stormy day, not its usual location. It's similar-ish to an Apple II. So it's got the sloped keyboard, and it's actually joined onto the case, even though it looks like it can be separated. It has a single floppy drive and this large case. The monitor sits on top, so that's a separate unit. And you can either buy the Monitor 3, or you can plug it into another monitor, RGB or composite. So what else to say about these pictures? So we'll talk a bit about the case and why that was a limitation in the original design. On the side there, I've got a just an SD floppy emulator, and that's why the lid of the case is slightly forward. So normally the floppy latch looks a bit more flush. It looks a bit askew there. The keyboard. So the original Apple II didn't do lowercase. It only had two cursor keys, left and right. Didn't have up and down. So the Apple III made it a bit easier to navigate. Didn't have a caps lock. And in the Apple III, they moved the reset key off the back of the keyboard. So you had to kind of put your hand over to press reset because it was too easy to bump it in its old location. Oh, and of course, businesses need a number pad as well, especially for things like VisiCalc. So a much better keyboard. So let's look at the features of the Apple III. So as I alluded to earlier, the case. So late 70s, the FCC was threatening to regulate computers and plug-in game consoles, like Atari, that plug into your TV, because they were emitting too much RF interference and causing problems with televisions, ham radio, other devices. They hadn't come out with what their exact restrictions and rules were, but Apple was expecting that there was going to be some regulation, and without knowing what that was, they had to fully shield the Apple III in preparation. So they decided to build this fully aluminium case. And so here's the case here with all the keyboard removed from the front and the case top removed. And you see it's a big hunk of aluminium. The motherboard fit in this rectangle all the way under the keyboard, power supply on the left, and room for slots. So one of the limiting factors was that the case was designed and the lead times were so great before they'd finished laying out the motherboard. And so they had to fit the motherboard design into the space that they'd already built. The solid aluminium case was actually built by a car transmission manufacturer because it was hard to find someone that could drop aluminium in the right shape of this size. And because the motherboard was sort of crammed in the solid case and Jobs wouldn't allow them to put a fan, there were heat issues in the case, and that, alluding to some problems. So second feature was a floppy drive. So here's the built-in floppy with the cover removed. It's very similar to an Apple Disk 2 floppy drive with a couple of extra lines on the cable, one to detect whether the disk was inserted. So the drive didn't have to go chicka 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 like it does on a Apple II to figure out if there's a disk in there, and also to allow drive select for a chain of external floppy drives. And these are what the Disk 3 external drives look like. And you can chain 4 of them in a row. The computer was different than the Apple II. So the Apple II had a lot of code in ROM from, above that 48K mark up to the 64K. There was AppleSoft, and also every card that you plugged in to your Apple II had ROM on it. And so developers of the card could bake the code for the devices into the card, and the Apple could access that memory mapped into the main address space. But the Apple III went for a software-defined approach, and so the ROM was very minimal. So it just did a basic power-on test, and then bootstrapped booting off the floppy. But only the internal floppy could be booted off. So you had to have a disk in even once you got a hard drive. The processor, so 6502, just like the Apple I and the Apple II, they clocked it at 2 megahertz. The 6502 at 2 megahertz was a bit hot, so they had to get a lower heat version, which was the Cinetech 6502B. It was an 8-bit processor, so just simple arithmetic, numbers up to 255, I guess. But it allowed 16-bit addressing, which meant that you could access up to 64K of RAM. And the way that the 6502 worked, there was a couple of segments of RAM that were special. So the 0 page was that the first part of memory starting at position 0, which the 6502 has instructions that let you more quickly access that part of memory. So sort of encouraging you to put regularly used values in there, such as loop iterators and things like that. And also the 0 1 page was used for the processor's stack. And so this kind of that's kind of the limitations of the processor. But in designing the Apple III, Dr. Sander came up with an approach to address more than the 64K of memory by using a process similar to bank switching in the Apple II and other computers of its era. But he actually built a whole bunch of circuitry outside the Apple II to allow banks of 32Ks to be moved around, or pages to be moved in and out. And so you could have one bank, which is for the operating system, and then your program could switch between other banks of memory as it needed more space. And also allowed the 0 page and the stack to be bank switched, which made it much easier to switch between different programs, or the operating system and the user program, or to handle interrupts. So there's relatively complicated circuitry to allow this memory mapping feature. And Dr. Sanders said it, he really turned a 16-bit chip, the 6502, from only supporting 64K to support all the way up to 512K of RAM. It actually only shipped with support for up to 256K, and the original Apple III shipped with 128K. RAM was still expensive in 1980 when the Apple III launched. The motherboard, so as I alluded to it in Colette's slide earlier, it was hand laid out, and it was extremely dense. It was only a 2-layer motherboard. They wanted to keep it just 2 layers for cost, just the top and the bottom, which meant they had to pack a lot into it, and they had that fixed physical space. The traces going from chip to chip were very close together and going between the legs of pins to get to the other side, and push the tolerances of their manufacturing. So it was hard to solder the chips in or the sockets in without bridging other traces. And there wasn't really enough space on the motherboard to have nice wide traces for the power and ground. And so Colette used these rather novel bus bars, which allowed power to be distributed essentially, I guess, in a third dimension. A bit more wire, I guess, going up, connecting different parts of the board together. The motherboard couldn't fit everything in, so memory was actually as a daughter board on top, and it fit into the motherboard via these connectors on both sides. They built a new operating system to replace, DOS 3.3 was the one on the Apple II, and they wanted to do more. So businesses were going to be using more files. They were going to have larger hard drives, or hard drives, and needed a way to store their files in a better way than a single directory. And so they came up with a hierarchical file system. And the other thing, because the Apple II didn't have the ROM code in the chips or built in, or in the cards or built into the machine, everything was built with drivers. So SOS was the name of the operating system. So it stood for Sarah's operating system, because the computer was called Sarah. And then the acronym was changed to Sophisticated Operating System. So SOS was built, and what you would do is you would use the system control program to pick which drivers you wanted to be on your boot floppy. So you'd have a console driver, which would be keyboard and text screen. You might have a graphics driver if you're going to do graphics. You might use a sound driver. You might use a parallel driver. You might use a driver for a hard drive. You would pick the drivers that you were using. They would get baked into your boot floppy, and then you didn't need to have any other drivers. And because it was all software defined, you could actually turn drivers on and off. So in order to speed the computer up, you could disable the screen for a while, so the computer wasn't wasting any cycles outputting text while you're doing your spreadsheet calculations or whatever. And so you disable the console driver, do your calculations, and then re-enable it. The operating system was also API based rather than having code and fixed memory locations. So this was something that they realized was a downside with providing so much code in ROM. So AppleSoft was in ROM, DOS. People who were programming for the Apple II started using the ROM routines. Well, that's what they were designed for. Use the ROM routines rather than their own code, and they would use them by calling to a specific fixed memory location and expecting that the code there would run the routine they wanted. And so some of these locations were documented, might be like output a character to the text screen or clear the screen. And other ones were just handy functions that would return to caller, that if you happen to know they were in this memory position, you could just use that function rather than using your own implementation of multiplication or whatever. And that really limited the Apple II, because as they were doing bug fixes or releasing new features for AppleSoft or the ROM, they would have to still keep all the entry points all in the right places. I mean, it wasn't even the documented entry points, it was anything that games used or other software used. If Apple moved them, then the game or other software wouldn't run anymore. And so they would do things like, they wanted to do a bug fix in one particular bit of memory, they would have to keep the same entry point, jump to some other empty space in memory, write the code, and then jump back and continue. So yeah, SOS incorporated quite a lot of quite modern concepts. Like a driver-based operating system wasn't something that we'd see on other computers for a while. And that and the hierarchical file system and the fact that you kind of picked your drivers and put them next to the kernel and built a boot floppy felt a lot like building a kernel in Unix, or sort of building your own custom boot image. SOS also got backported essentially into the Apple II as ProDOS. So a lot of the SOS concepts are in ProDOS, but I guess ProDOS came later after the Apple III was released. And their disk formats are compatible. Graphics and sound. So the Apple III got rid of some of the shortcomings of the Apple II. So there was a weird way of displaying graphics that was interleaving data for each pixel across memory in ways that made it fast to output on the screen, but harder for programmers to program against. And also because the way that the color was generated in the Apple II, which was awesome for 1976, it was kind of a hack, outputting color based on the timing of color burst signals and NTSC. So when they had the chance to revisit this for the Apple III, they were able to come up with relatively high resolution, full color, 16 color, 280 by 192 with none of the limitations around, certain colors can't be next to each other like there was on the Apple II. And then a high res black and white 560 by 192, which is quite high res. It had a DAC in there for sound, and it was actually capable of producing speech, that sounded like a human voice. And there was a speaker output as well as a built-in speaker. Built into the Apple III, it could do RGB to an Apple RGB monitor or other RGB monitors, as well as the standard composite black and white output. They had the ability to load your own fonts into the Apple III. So on the Apple II, the font was burnt into a ROM. On the Apple III, software could define what fonts it wanted. And there wasn't very many games built for the Apple III, but some of the ones that were built used the fonts as kind of sprite, not really sprites, but like for their characters in the games. define your own fonts for them. And the Apple III also allowed smooth text scrolling, so you could actually scroll pixel by pixel up the screen, a page of text, rather than jumping line by line. So it was quite a jump ahead. Here's a demo of the Apple III's color. So this is on my computer, so apologize for the flicker. There probably is a better video of this online if you search for Apple III running horses. But look, it's actually running on an IBM CGA monitor. So you don't normally see a zoom out of a Apple display on an IBM monitor sitting on top of an Apple III. And you see there's like a nice 16 color output. And this animation, these running horses running off to the side of the screen, is actually a custom font. I think each horse is like 12 or 16 separate characters that have been redrawn. And then there's an overlay of what color is at each position on the screen, overlaying the font. So I was able to produce some pretty good graphics actually just in text mode without even getting into the high res modes yet. So that's pretty cool. Built-in port, so rather than having to buy a third-party card, you got a serial port. Real-time clock, although there was a bit of a sad story there. They had to pull the real-time clock just before release because the chip manufacturer couldn't produce any chips that wouldn't fail. But then people added the clock back in later on. 2 joystick ports, but they didn't use the old weird Apple II joystick standard, which was hard for games to program against, but used an easier standard. But it meant your joysticks didn't work. You need to buy special joysticks for the Apple III. The silent type thermal printer can be plugged into that joystick port as well. Just switch the driver. And there was 4 expansion slots in the Apple III that were electrically compatible with the Apple II one. And so if there was a card for an Apple II that you wanted to use, like a card for a 3.5-inch disk drive, like the Lyron card, or a hard drive, you could plug that into your Apple III. It wouldn't boot or wouldn't load the ROM into addressable memory space off the card. Instead, the developer of the card would need to write a driver, which you would then load into SOS on your boot disk. And some of the hardware products for Apple III were actually just Apple II hardware, but where a SOS driver had been written, and sometimes the SOS drivers were written by third parties. This is the monitor you often see with the Apple III, although it was actually more popular as an Apple II monitor. It's called the Monitor 3. It's usually a green screen, although there are some white phosphor versions of it. It's a relatively slow phosphor, which means it's nice on your eyes when you're reading text. Doesn't flicker too much. Not so great for fast-moving graphics because the image lingers. And one of the interesting things you'll see if you find one of these is there's a fabric anti-glare shield over the glass, and it looks like this when you zoom in, kind of like a grid. And they do get damaged, so mine's got a little scuff on it, but sometimes they'll get ripped. And what people would do is go around the edge of the glass with a knife and actually cut out the fabric. Or I've seen some people actually take apart the monitor and stretch pantyhose over as a replacement anti-glare shield. Another common accessory is the profile. So this one of mine is a non-working display profile. So the profile is a 5 megabyte hard drive, codename Pippin. And it was released in 1981, so not long after the Apple III. And you'd put a interface card into your Apple III, you'd put a driver onto your boot floppy, and then you'd plug the profile drive into the card, and now you had a 5 meg drive, which was huge. That's like tens of floppy disks. And later on, they came out with a 10 meg version of the profile. You more commonly see profiles sitting on top of Lisas because it was the standard hard drive for the Apple Lisa, or on Apple IIs as well. The profile, as I was saying, required you to boot from a floppy. So it means that if your Apple III doesn't have a working floppy drive, you can't get into the hard drive very easily. And also, yeah, so every time you wanted to use a computer, you had to wait for it to boot off floppy first. Software. So Apple was quite slow at releasing schematics, documentation, software, programming languages for the Apple III. And this was one of the contributors to its low market appeal. But they did eventually release a pretty good suite of programming languages. There was Business Basic, which was a port or rewrite of AppleSoft that they rushed out because their version of Pascal wasn't going to be ready in time for launch. They released COBOL, I think. They had a Fortran in the works, may not have been released. And, when you look at the three now, there's a bundle of, first party and third party software for it. But it's still orders of magnitude less software than for the Apple II. And the software was really, one of the limiting reasons why people didn't want to buy an Apple III. People didn't want to buy an Apple III because there wasn't much software for it, and people didn't want to write software for the Apple III because not many of them are sold. So it was that chicken and egg. VisiCalc was one of the killer apps of the Apple III. The Apple III was one of the was the only home or personal computer that could run in greater than 64K of RAM, and so you could have bigger spreadsheets in VisiCalc 3 than you could anywhere else, and so businesses used it for their analytics. There was also 3 Easy Pieces, which is very similar to AppleWorks on the Apple II and shares the same file format, and other software such as file errors and modem utilities, dialers, things like that. To support or to encourage people to use the Apple III and access the existing library of Apple II software, there was an Apple II emulation mode. And New Zealander Andrew was saying that the Apple II emulation mode was really good at the time. So what they targeted was a 64K Apple II Plus, which in 1980 was the best Apple II you could get. And what you'd do is you'd boot the Apple III with a Apple II emulation floppy, and you could choose whether you wanted AppleSoft or Integer Basic, what cards you wanted in there, what baud rates, etc. And that would actually load the code that would normally be in ROM for AppleSoft or DOS or a serial card, and actually put it into the RAM of the Apple III. Then you'd you boot that floppy, take that out, and put in your Apple II floppy, and then the Apple III would flip some settings internally that would now use the ROM code that had loaded into RAM to emulate being an Apple II. So it was a pretty impressive engineering feat, but it meant that in Apple II emulation mode, you couldn't use these new features of the Apple III. So you couldn't use, the rest of your 256K of RAM. You couldn't use lowercase characters because Apple II Pluses didn't have them. You couldn't use 80-column text or advanced graphics and sound, the clock if you had one. And so, when it first came out, this was a good way for people to be able to use their Apple II software. But as the Apple II line progressed to the Apple IIe, the Platinum, the Apple III was left behind because the new software that required a language card or that used lowercase just wouldn't run in this emulation mode. Andrew was saying when we were talking about, New Zealand uses of the Apple III, that his father basically used their Apple III as an Apple II. So it was always boot into Apple II emulation mode and then run the Apple II software. And I think Apple released, I think it was called "So What Can I Do with My Apple III?" a guide to like software on the Apple III, and a lot of that software was Apple II software that you could run on the Apple III. So many early Apple II games will work, but the later ones later on in the 80s won't work. There was information about funny mode or Satan mode written up internally in Apple and in some magazines of how you could try and break out of this emulation mode and get access to some of the Apple III features, but it was never fully supported and was relatively buggy. And I'll share these slides, but there's a link to Paul Hagstrom's talk at Kansas Fest 2021 where he talks about funny mode on the Apple III. The keyboard, I already mostly talked about this keyboard actually. One of the nice features was auto repeat, so people would sometimes modify their Apple IIs to allow auto repeat, especially for the cursor keys, so you can move around without going dip, 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 dip. The Apple III also had a fun feature on the cursor keys, which is they had two positions. Push it halfway and you go up or down slowly, and you push the key fully in and you'd zoom up the screen. So sort of variable weight key press, which is pretty unusual. Yeah, and there's obviously the numeric keypad, which is great for business applications, the reset button, etc. Okay, so the fallout. So unfortunately, the Apple III launch didn't go well. So it was released early without appropriate testing, it has to be said. And, Wendell Sanders said, maybe 6 to 9 more months, and it would have been solid at release. It was sold to business customers, which are much less accommodating of problems with their computers. They're not hobbyists tinkering around. They want the computer to turn on and work. And one of the problems that, or two of the problems really that people would have was overheating. So the 3 could get quite hot in that solid metal case, and the motherboard went under the keyboard and there wasn't much space for the processor to dissipate heat. Although the case was designed to be a heatsink. And the other problem was random freezes. So you'd be using the computer and it would freeze. And that you'd lose all your work. Back then, before the internet and social media, fixes and problems took a much longer time to percolate. So I think Dr. Sanders said it didn't take them long to figure out what the problem was, but the weekly and monthly magazines had already started talking about the failures in the Apple IIIs and the problems people were having with them, dead on arrival or dead soon after. And the reputation of the Apple III was harmed. And the magazines would speculate about the reasons, was it heat, was it oxidation, was the motherboard too thin and flexing inside? And it turned out, and the other thing was drop 3 inches. So the podcast is named after this phenomenon, which is apparently if your computer was freezing up, they would say, lift it up off the desk and drop it. And that will reset all the chips. And there was these ideas that maybe if you press down on the chips, you'd reset them, or you drop it and that might fix the issue. But actually the reliability issue was caused by this RAM daughter board. So this isn't the original RAM daughter board. I think this is the replacement one, but the connectors between the pins coming up from the motherboard and the RAM boards sitting on top would oxidate and loosen. And so the problem was actually when the computer was freezing, heat or flex or oxidation were causing that connection to be bad and causing the freeze. And these things that you did, such as dropping it or pushing on the chips, were just moving it enough to get it back in place. So they ended up recalling. Now, it's not clear how many Apples were recalled. Someone said a couple of thousand, but it was the Apple III's with serial numbers lower than 14,000 were recalled, and they had a replacement um, internals, new motherboard and RAM board put in them. And Taylor Pullman, who's interviewed on the Drop 3 Inches podcast, talks about how some customers they had to do several attempts at fixing the issues on the Apple III. They send it back to them, there's a problem, they send it back. But he said that Apple had a reputation of, putting it right for these customers. They'll do whatever it takes to fix their Apple III. But that coupled with, the reliability and the lack of software meant that the Apple III didn't get great reviews. It was higher priced than the Apple II. It didn't do substantially more than an Apple II, which was souped up with a lot of add-in cards. And it led to it not selling well. When they launched the Apple III in 1980, Apple actually stopped a lot of the development of the Apple II, thinking that the Apple III was going to be the next thing to focus the business on. But they realized then, and I guess over the remaining 80s and early 90s, that the Apple II was the cash cow that kept the company running. Apple made a lot of mistakes and tried lots of things, and all of them were funded by the sales of the Apple II. And at some point in the early 80s, they lost heart in the Apple III. The community, best represented by the On3 magazine, which is a magazine put out by Bob Consorti and his company On3, but it was a combination between his company's magazine and the community's magazine. There's a lot of write-in letters, and you can see the early issues, people talking about not much software and waiting for the documentation to arrive. Then they talk about Apple seemingly losing interest in the III, but still selling it. And then Apple internally is considering canceling the III, but they have a lot of inventory that they still need to sell. So they sort of keep it on life support, but they've lost heart in it being the success of the company. And I guess by this time, the Lisa and the Macintosh are much further ahead in the development. And then there's a half-hearted attempt at a new revision of the III called the III Plus before the whole line was abruptly discontinued in 1985. And the community didn't take this neglect well. 75,000 wasn't a lot sold, but the people that had them liked them. There's talk of companies where the whole company used Apple IIIs. I mean, Apple internally used Apple IIIs on every desktop. A lot of the Lisa and Mac developers and the Apple II developers wrote their code on Apple IIIs. Whole companies used Apple IIIs for their spreadsheets and other work, and they liked them. They worked well. And then hobbyists who had bought Apple IIIs also liked them. And they didn't take well to being neglected. But On3 and some other software and hardware developers continued supporting the Apple III and continued producing new hardware. We'll talk about some of that hardware a little bit later. So the New Zealand effect of the Apple III. So I didn't find much. There was a review in the 1983 Bits and Byte magazine saying that the Apple III is a powerful, flexible synthesis of hardware and software. While some may criticize it for unadventurous architecture and for using a proprietary operating system, this does not appear to be a major disadvantage. So I suppose by 1983, the 6502 was looking a little bit old, and the proprietary operating system of SOS maybe wasn't as widespread as a CP/M or at that time, I guess, MS-DOS operating system. But the conclusion was it was still worth a look for small business. So on the Vintage Computing Aotearoa online meetup, we talked about whether people had seen the Apple III in New Zealand and other situations. So Andrew's family had one. They used it primarily in Apple II emulation mode, but used it for many years. Someone else seen them in business, someone had seen it imported, but it doesn't appear to have been a lot of them in New Zealand. And I guess, being more expensive than the Apple II, they may not have sold as many. Apple II was quite prolific in New Zealand. So upgrades. So back in the day, there were some contemporary upgrades produced. So the memory board went up to 256K, and the supporting chips that enabled the CPU to access more than 64K with that memory mapping supported only up to 256K. But Wendell Sander actually helped on 3 develop a 512K board. And so this RAM was still expensive, so to keep the price down, you'd send in your 256K board. They would extract the chips, put them into a 512K board, and only sell you for the extra 256. And that would be attached by plugging it into the risers, and then also changing some ROMs and adding some extra lines to various chips to be able to address the higher memory. My Apple III came with one of those in it. So there's a little homebrew looking, but 512K in a 1980 computer is pretty good. The Softcard 3, so running CP/M was obviously quite common for businesses. So Apple approached Microsoft and asked them to make an Apple III version of the Softcard. Microsoft requested the source code to SOS in order to do this. And there's a bit of a funny story relayed by Taylor Pullman on the Drop 3 Inches podcast, that Apple was reluctant to give the source code to Microsoft because, Microsoft developed their own operating system, DOS, MS-DOS, and it was kind of a competitor to Apple by this time. But I think they relented and let Microsoft have the source code. But then the person at Microsoft that worked on the Softcard 3 also worked on the new version of DOS 2, I think he said. And that included some features that were very SOS-like, so drivers and hierarchical file system. And there's a sort of implication that Microsoft might have benefited in their operating system from seeing SOS. So it's kind of funny to think that, the lineage of Microsoft DOS through Windows all the way up to where we are now might have had an Apple operating system right down at the bottom. Microsoft and Apple have a complicated history together, don't they? There was other hardware you could add on to your Apple III, so double-sided or higher density 5.25 inch, 3.5 inch drive controllers, third-party hard drives. Most of these were Apple II peripherals that, because they were electrically compatible, could be plugged into your Apple III, and then the manufacturer or a third party would write a driver so that you could access that card and access those devices. So modern Apple III peripherals, I think I have most of these. So Joe's Computer Museum, he's built a Softcard 3 reproduction. So this lets you run CP/M on your Apple III. Tested that and it works well. He's also built an RGB adapter. So the RGB port was designed for an Apple monitor that I don't have. I don't think many people have that RGB monitor. So Joe's built this board, and you can get a nice 3D printed case for it that's the same color as the Apple III backplate. That lets you plug in a CGA cable, lets you plug into the 2GS standard monitor, which is a lot easier to get, or an NTSC composite. So the composite signal that comes out of the Apple III is only black and white, unless you're in Apple II emulation mode, in which case it's color. But if you plug into this composite, you can actually get color NTSC. So yeah, kind of a cool add-on board. And that was how I did the video of the running horses on my CGA monitor. Another thing you can get is a modern replacement for a profile. So that was the big Pippin hard drive. So this is actually an open source project for some hardware that you can attach to your Pocket Beagle and program it with the software to emulate being a profile drive. Arcane Byte sell a ready-made one of these, which is much easier. And so you follow that link once you get these slides. But it still requires a profile card in your Apple III, which is an Apple III profile card, which aren't necessarily easy to get. But because it emulates a profile, these are kind of fun devices because you can plug them into your Apple Lisa or your Apple II if you've got a II profile card. I think you have to format the profile differently for the different devices. Slightly easier to use because it's an all-in-one is the CFFA. So the CFFA card, there's an Apple I version, CFFA 1. The CFFA 2, I think, is the original, which is a hard drive emulator or hard drive replacement using a compact flash card. And then the CFFA 3000, which is the one that's put here, also emulates a floppy drive. So in your Apple II, this is the bomb. Like the CFFA 3000 sold really well, and when R&D automation stopped producing them, the price on the aftermarket started getting really high because people really like having these in their Apple IIs or 2GSs because it can be a floppy drive, it can be a hard drive, it can have multiple partitions up to 32 meg each. It's great. Luckily, Reactive Micro is now selling the CFFA 3000s, so you could buy one of them for your Apple III, but because the floppy emulation doesn't work in the 3 anyway, because the floppy drive works differently on the 3, you don't need a 3000, you can just buy a CFFA 2, and Vernon actually assembles them and sells them occasionally on Trade Me. So if you keep your eyes open, you may be able to buy one there. But of course, remember, you still need a boot floppy, just like for any other Apple III device. The drivers for it are actually on your initial boot floppy. This one's even cheaper. It's called a Booty. This emulates a ProDOS block device. And Rob Justice has built a driver for the Apple III. So it's relatively cheap. You can buy it from Chris Torrance's site that's linked here. He ships from the US, but he actually gets them from David Mutimer in Australia, who I think is having some trouble sourcing parts at the moment, but you may be able to contact him on Facebook to buy them directly and will be cheaper than ordering from the US. With shipping prices these days. Rob Justice has also built a new ROM chip image. So I haven't tried this, but as I was saying, one of the problems with the Apple III is you need a boot floppy. And the nice thing about what he's built is that instead of bootstrapping itself off the floppy disk, his ROM has enough code to bootstrap itself off a ProDOS block device, which means that you can boot a Booty or a CFFA 3000 or a CFFA 1 without actually having a floppy disk in the drive. So that's great for people with Apple IIIs with broken floppy drives because those are hard to get these days. Apple don't send you them anymore. Something that you could get back in the day that I probably should have talked about earlier in the talk is you had your Apple III and it could emulate a 1980s Apple II Plus, but you wanted to have more RAM. And so you could buy a 3+2, and this is a card from Titan that you could plug into your Apple III, and it would support more modern Apple II features. And then when the Apple IIe came out, they produced an add-on to the add-on card called the 3+2e. So you'd plug this into another port and link it to the 3+2 card, and then you would get the features of the Apple IIe in emulation on your Apple III. So back in the day, that might have been cheaper than buying a separate Apple IIe. And it's certainly less desk space. Having an Apple III and an Apple II on your desk with two monitors would be kind of a pain. But nowadays, these things are very expensive. I'm guessing not many were produced, and they're quite rare. And I think near the end of the run, the owner of Titan was making them out of their house to try and satisfy, demand. But at some point, they stopped being produced, and now they're quite expensive. So now to have an Apple III with a 3+2 and a 3+2e card in it would cost you significantly more than just having an Apple III and then turning to your right and having an Apple IIe. Apple IIes are quite cheap. But there is rumors that there may be modern recreations of these cards coming soon. So yeah, if you hang out on the communities, hopefully someone will start selling recreations of these so you can kind of experience what it's like to emulate a 2E inside an Apple III. Yeah, I'll probably buy one. It sounds fun. I mean, ultimately not necessary, but fun. The first thing that broke in mine was the power supply. Of course, the reefer capacitor blew and a nice smoky exhibition. You can put new capacitors in your power supply, but Reactive Micro sell replacement power supplies for Apple IIs and Apple IIIs that are based on desktop PC power supplies that have been modified to work with Apple voltages, and they come with this nice circuit board that you snap to the right shape, and it's got risers and screw holes in the right place so that it fits nicely inside your original power supply. So I've got one of these inside my original Apple III power supply, and it's modern componentry and will run well, hopefully for another 20, 30 years without problems. And then new old stock. So when Apple discontinued the 3, they sold off the remaining stock to Sun Remarketing, which was a company that then sold the leftovers to the community. And they actually, I think, continued to produce some Apple III hardware and software to the remaining community after Apple had given up. Sun Remarketing also got the remaining Lisa stock after that was discontinued. And then when Sun Remarketing gave up that business, John from Vintage Micros bought the stock from them. I believe that's where he got it from. And so now there's Vintage Micros who sell on his own website and also on eBay a lot of new old stock and some secondhand Apple III and Lisa hardware. And from what I understand, he's kind of winding up some parts of his business and selling off some of the stock. So if you're interested in Apple III stuff, it's probably a good time to get in and have a look. Maybe their profile interface might be a good one to get. And that's my roundup. Oh, I think the last thing that I bought, which I probably could have made myself, but I'm not good at that stuff, is Vintage Micros. John made me a cable so that I could plug an Apple II floppy in place of the built-in floppy on the Apple III. And that means that I can use a regular Apple II floppy emulator instead of having to use the built-in floppy drive, so I can boot off an SD card. So yeah, that was a fun walk through the history of the Apple III. If you're interested in more information, the Drop 3 Inches podcast is what got me really interested in the unique parts of the Apple III. It seems like it's similar to an Apple II. but it really is quite different. The operating system is more advanced. There's no, boot in your own basic straight away kind of prompt like you got in DOS 3.3. There's text-based, user interfaces. The podcast has interviews with people like Wendell Sander and Colette Askeland, and other Apple III community members. And it's just a great resource of sort of an oral history and conversation about the Apple III. Hopefully you'll enjoy listening to it as much as I did. There's a great site called apple3.org with heaps of information on it. The Washington Apple Pie was an Apple users group based in, I don't know if it was DC or I think, or Seattle, Washington State. Anyway, they had an Apple III special interest group, and how the user group would work is they would have floppy disks of public domain software, and you'd go to a user group meet and you could buy the floppies that you wanted, and they had a big catalog of all the disks. As the Apple III wound up, as the market dried up, the Apple Pie group actually asked commercial software creators if they could public domain their software and include it in their collection. And they've actually put all the disk images plus heaps of other Apple III resources into one big DVD image. And you can download that from the Washington Apple Pie site. There's an Apple III enthusiast Facebook group where people discuss repairs and other tidbits about the III. There's lots of random Apple III documents uploaded to archive.org. Things like business basic manuals or things like that. There's a website called Apple III Resource, which has a bunch of stuff on it. And if you're interested in emulators, there's an older emulator called Sarah, but the one I've had more luck with is MESS or MAME. So there's an Apple III emulator there. I've put a link to the RTR, which is a ready-made hard drive image with a bunch of common Apple III software. So that's quite fun because you can boot it up and see what a 3 is without having to figure out how to copy your software onto the hard drive, because that's actually not as easy as it seems, because a lot of the software is designed for use on with a floppy disk boot, and may even have copy protection. And then there's also the Ample emulator, and that's quite a good wrapper around MESS. And I'll just give you a demo of that now so you can see the Apple III in action. So excuse me for a sec, I'll just join this call. So Ample is a wrapper around MAME that makes it a little bit easier for you to use. MAME's a pretty fully featured emulator, as you've probably played with it before. So let's just share my entire screen. Did that work? Yeah, here we go. And so what you can do in Ample is, you can choose which machine you want to emulate. It'll try and find the ROMs for the machine, which aren't typically bundled with MAME. You choose how much RAM you want to give it. I'm choosing to put CFFA card in and boot off a floppy, but you can actually also use Rob Justice's boot ROM. And then I've got an Apple III hard drive image that I've been playing around with, which is based on that RTR one. And when you click launch, it'll just start up the Apple III for you. Oops, I had the debugger still turned on. Oh, wow, it's pretty cool having a debugger for a running computer. I guess that's one of the cool things about emulation. So BOSS is actually the community-funded extension to SOS that was built in 1993, according to that. So what the community did was they raised some funds, some of the user groups, to pay Bob Consorti, who was the owner of On3, to build an updated version of SOS with some new features that they requested. And one of the things it has is this program switcher. So you can switch between the screens with tab and then move the cursor around to see the different programs. So yeah, 3 easy pieces is the Apple Writer equivalent. Oops. Is it going to work? Oh yeah, test. Yeah, so test. And you see how it's flashing where the cursor position is. So yeah, Andrew from the New Zealand group was talking about how, showing your insert position was quite cool. You can use the Apple keys in the emulator, this command and option, and do what you normally do. So let's, let's quit that. Yes, see how they've made like a nice GUI, but just using with text characters. It's pretty cool. Something that else that On3 built was desktop accessories and clock widgets, so that you could, from any program, view your clock or switch to your address book. I was going to show Business Basics, so it's very familiar if you've used an Apple II. It drops you to a basic prompt. You can type catalog and see what's on the disk. You can run. So I think there's some basic programs you can run and write your own programs. And Business Basic has some extra features around file handling and arithmetic. Yeah, make it, I guess, a step up from AppleSoft. And Pascal and other stuff. So yeah, it's a really fun way to see what an Apple III was like. Yeah, as I was saying, when you turn the Apple III on, it's not like an Apple II. So if you've got no disks in it, you turn it on, you can't do nothing. All you get is a screen that says retry and a flashing arrow. That's all the ROM does if there's no boot disk. Cool. So that's the end of my talk. I'll put this video and slides up. Thank you very much for listening. Hopefully I'll see you at more Vintage Computing Aotearoa meetups. Move back to the right slide. Our meetups I'm listing on vintagecomputing.nz, which is a website. Also, if you join the New Zealand Vintage Computing Facebook group, that's where the discussion is happening. So yeah, see you there. Thank you very much.